JTS. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the final session of our summer series, A Wandering People, Jewish Journeys, Real and Imagined. I've learned so much from our faculty this summer. I hope you feel the same. And if anyone is joining us today for the first time, of course, welcome to you as well. Our session today is Traveling to Babylon for Good. And I will let Professor David Kramer tell us more about it when he begins to teach. We want to thank the generous sponsors of today's session, Rabbi Mark and Freda Bisman, who have sponsored in honor of their teachers at JTS in 1965 to 73. So thank you so much, Rabbi Bisman and Freda, and we love having you at all of the sessions, and we're honored by your presence, and thank you so much for your sponsorship. And we're also so grateful to Les and Jane Bergen for sponsoring today at the Chacham level as well, the 540 level. Thank you to the Bergens and the Bismans for making this session possible. If you're interested in sponsoring a session for our fall series, we have opportunities available. And we will tell you more about that when we publicize the fall series. Let me tell you about it a little bit. The reason we haven't put it out yet is because we're tweaking the name, but I'm very excited about the series. The series, let me tell you about it even without the name. It's really about what Jews do for work, and what have we done over the course of our history, and why. What did we do in different places at different times? What historical factors drew us to different kinds of professions? Jewish involvement in the labor movement, Jewish professions as broken down by gender, all manner of things related to what Jews have done professionally, and also how we think about work. Of course, we have Shabbat, so we have kind of specific concepts in our tradition about work and rest. So that's the fall series, and it's, as usual, a huge variety of JTS scholars addressing this topic from many different perspectives. So I think it will be wonderful, and you will hear about it soon. By email, and we also hopefully have already gotten emails about, we have a standalone Monday webinar on September 13th between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur with Rabbi Gordon Tucker on probing the idea of atonement and looking in particular at the Untitled Chapter prayer from the high holidays. So we hope to see you there as well, and then the new session will start after the holidays. Okay, so back to today. If you would like to, Professor Kramer will pause a couple of times, once or twice during the class, then we'll have Q&A at the end to take questions. And if you'd like to ask him a question, you can send it to me, Rabbi Julia Andelman, using the chat feature, and I will choose as many of them as we have time for. And if you have a question of a technical or logistical nature, you can use the chat feature to send that to Stacy Firestone or Lynn Feynman. You should have received the sources for today's class in email, and we'll post them in the chat as well. All right, and on that note, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Kramer, who has often kicked off our series. This time around, he's closing it. He is the Joseph J. and Dora Abbell Librarian at JTS, where he's also served as Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics for many years. As librarian, Professor Kramer is at the helm of the most extensive collection of Judaica in the Western Hemisphere. He's a prolific author and commentator. His most recent book is A History of the Talmud from its origins to the present day, which just came out in 2019. And he is also a prolific teacher for JTS community learning program. So Professor Kramer, thank you for teaching today, and I turn it over to you.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Okay. It's great to see all of you. Can I be heard okay? Stacy, Julie? Okay, great. So I'm not looking at myself. I'm bored of looking at myself. I'm going to put for us on gallery to begin with and say it's great to see all of you. I do have to say that we should stop meeting like this. I really mean that. I wish the world would go back to a place where we could do this voluntarily and not because it's the only option we have for large groups. But it is great to see you, and it is great to know that the alternative we are using now allows us to talk to one another and to learn with one another from across large expanses even larger than the one that we're going to consider today. So we're going to speak about, I'm going to speak about, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and make comments at several occasions over the course of my presentation. We're going to talk about the travels that took place between the land of Israel and Babylonia, what Jews continue to call Babylonia in any case, in the period of the rabbis. That is to say, from the latter part of the 2nd century of the Common Era through the 6th century of the Common Era. This was a very important period in Jewish history for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that this is the period during which the Talmud came to formation, both Talmuds, but particularly the Babylonian Talmud, which of course is the document that came to define Jewish practice in all manners of Jewish life throughout the ages. And so the nexus we're going to see, the land of Israel and its production of the Mishnah near the beginning of this period, the Mishnah being the first record we have of rabbinic law, and the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, which comes at the end of this period. We're going to consider what was the relationship of these communities as it came to be manifest in the travelers who went back and forth. In order to appreciate this, we need two contexts. One is a historical context and one is a geographical context. So I'm going to begin with the historical context and then go to the geographical context, for which I will share my screen and we'll look at a map. But history first. The history of Jews in Babylon goes back long before the period that we're going to be considering today. It goes back, of course, to the Babylonian exile of the early 6th century BCE, 599 BCE to 587, 586 BCE was when the waves of expulsion took place and led many, not all, but many Jews who lived in the land of Israel to be relocated according to Babylonian imperial policy to Babylon. And the community that was settled in Babylon, though there were many who came back at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and actually even before that, so latter part of the 6th century to the mid-5th century before the Common Era, there were returns, but there were many who remained behind as well. And so there was a Jewish community in Babylonia from, say, the year 600 BCE, rounding a little bit, all the way up to the period that we're discussing now. And it's clear from the few sources we have from these centuries, actually we have more than a few sources, but from only a few of those sources, it's clear that there were regular relations between the Jewish communities in Babylon and in the land of Israel, and there were travels in between, though these are not well documented. Come the 2nd century of the Common Era, following the conquest of the land of Israel by Rome, following the destruction of the temple in the year 70, the suppression of the first revolt in the year 73, at the end of the revolt, then another major revolt, which we know of through the name of Bar Kokhba between 133 and 135 in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Rome came to dominate the land of Israel powerfully, and as we will see in a text we'll consider in a moment, the hardships that came both with the first revolt, with the time of the destruction of the temple, and the second revolt at the time of Bar Kokhba, hardship leads people to leave. You don't hang around when your life gets more and more difficult. At least not all people hang around. So while Jews did remain in the land of Israel, crucially, and let me emphasize this because there is frequent confusion about this. At the time of the Romans, there was no exile. Right, Jews experienced a first exile to Babylon back in the early 500s before the Common Era. There was no latter exile at the hands of the Romans. There were prisoners of war who were brought to Rome. There were others who fled because of the difficult conditions that war created, but Jews continued to live in the land of Israel. Those of you who have had good tours in primarily Galilee, which is where the Jewish community relocated in the 2nd century, and particularly after the Bar Kokhba revolt. You may have been to the town of Tzipori, where they reenact some of what happened in rabbinic Jewish life during that period. And then when we go to the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, the new synagogues, all of the mosaic synagogue floors that you may have seen either in museums or on the ground in the land of Israel, that's all from this period. So Jews remained. But there were also some Jews who went elsewhere. And crucially, the Jews who had been in Babylon continued to be in Babylon. And they were supplemented, and we'll see something of this in a few moments, by rabbis, others as well. But what matters for our purposes is rabbis. The rabbis were a movement who began primarily after the destruction of the temple in the land of Israel, but many relocated to Babylon in the latter part of the 2nd century. From that point onward, there are two centers of the rabbinic want to explore as we consider the travels back and forth. So that's the historical setting. Let me now share my screen with you so that you can see the, whoops, wait 1 second. I'm gonna have to expand behind it in order to get it to you. Here we go. And back to my screen, sorry. Share screen, hello. Here it is, and share. Is my screen shared now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to go to the last page of this, which is actually a map. And can you see the map in front of you now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So this is the area of the world that matters for us. You can see that, this being a historical map to historians, what we call the land of Israel is by default known as Palestine, which is the name that it gained during the Roman era and has been known by that name in some permutation ever since. In any you can see that there is a definition here of a part of the world called the Fertile Crescent. The land of Israel, if you focus on it, I can't expand this on my screen, but you can expand it in your imagination. Obviously, to the west is the Mediterranean Sea. In the ancient world, seas and other bodies of water were great ways to travel from one to another. It was
David,
considerable Mediterranean trade.
David,
I'm sorry?
You're freezing up here and there. I don't know if there's anything else you can close. Yep, thanks.
Okay, and it's clear now?
It's good.
Okay, good. So I will take advantage of this. And let me go back to So, the sea was one way to travel, and it would have been a frequent one. There's considerable evidence we know of Greek Hellenistic influence in the land of Israel. Much of it came overseas to the various ports in Israel, and we can see it to this day. But if you then consider, and those of you who have been in Israel, been up to Jerusalem, looked down at the Dead Sea Basin, considered the mountains of Jordan that you can see on a clear day on the other side, a clear evening. To go east from the land of Israel is very, very difficult. First of all, from the coastal plain, you've got all those high mountains that even to this day, with much better highways, the trucks and the buses struggle on to get up to Jerusalem. To get down then to the Dead Sea, hot, very, very steep, very difficult to pass, and then back up on the Jordanian side would be prohibitive. There were isolated groups that did it, but this was not a major route. If you wanted to travel toward what we would see here on this map as the east, the way to do it was to go north. And interestingly, in biblical terminology, going to Babylon or an empire coming from Babylon or that area of the world is always called out of the north, because the way to travel was north, to go through the valley of Jezreel, which is where the mountainous spine of the land of Israel breaks between the Judean hills and the Carmel, and to head to the rivers in order to go south to Euphrates come closest. You will find marked the city and the center of the empire of Babylon. This is the way that travel happened, and it was very, very frequent. To step back for a moment, I've got to emphasize that despite what you have probably learned, and I learned in my past, the notion that in the world where travel was much more difficult than in ours, and people basically stayed where they were, not true. And certainly not true of Jews. We know that Jews traveled frequently through the ages, not just because we were forced from one place to the other. The evidence, for example, of the Cairo Geniza shows that Jews traveled widely. That was true in the ancient world as much as it was in the medieval world. Jews traveled for trade, it's true, but Jews, like others, and probably Jews more than others, traveled in order to see the world as well. And so the routes between the land of Israel, going north to what we today call Syria, then Assyria, and down the rivers to Babylon would have been much traveled. And this is the way the Jewish communities in each place would have known one another. So is that clear from the map, Julia? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go up and actually, we don't need that first page. We're going to be looking at the sources now in a moment. You can all still imagine what I look like? Yeah. Okay, good. So let me just give you a way to think about what we're about to see. If you had to guess, what are the two travel centers that are most frequently connected? And Julie, I'm going to put you on the spot because yours is the voice that I'm hearing and speaking with right now. The two travel centers that are most frequently connected, if on one side is, say, Ben Gurion Airport in the land of Israel, where is its most frequent flying partner, geographically speaking?
You're talking about today?
Today, yeah.
New York.
New York, absolutely. Add together the amount of flights that leave from Newark and JFK to Ben Gurion, and you have by far the most flights and passengers between the land of Israel and another center anywhere in the world. Why is that the case? All right, this is a question for everybody. The answer should be relatively obvious because these are the two great centers of the Jewish world. There is more Jewish creativity, wealth, productivity in various ways, religious commitment and life, just simply Jewish population in these two centers than there is anywhere in the Jewish world. Well, that was true then in the nexus between Babylon and the land of Israel. And so those who sought to rebuild Jewish life in the world after the destruction of the temple, the rabbis, found themselves going back and forth in just the same way as the two great centers of Jewish life are closely connected today. It took them longer to get back and forth, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't as important as it is for us today. So what I'd like to do is actually jump in here and consider how Babylon and the land of Israel interacted and the place that the travelers, and as you'll see in a moment, these were actually rabbinic messengers, see the place that they played in the drama of the relationship of these two centers. So on the top left of your screen, you'll see the earliest part of this drama, and it is told from the perspective of the land of Israel. And it makes a very, very clear point. So this is Midrash Shifrei. If some of you have studied with me before in discussions of diaspora, this is one of two texts we'll be looking at today that may be familiar to you. But very, very straightforward story. It begins by quoting a verse from Deuteronomy and then tells a story. It happened that Rabbi Judah ben Betera and Matthi ben Cheresh were leaving the land of Israel. This in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba War. And they arrived at Palton, on the border of Syria, going north, and they remembered the land of Israel. They raised their eyes and tears poured forth, and they tore their garments, and they recited the scripture that's quoted at the beginning here, and you shall inherit it and dwell in it and observe to do all these laws. And they said, the settlement of the land of Israel is equal in weight to all of the other commandments of the Torah. So that's a first thought. It's a first emotion. With such an emotion, if it's stuck, we might imagine that there would be severe pressure for not Jews in general alone, but rabbis in particular to settle in the land of Israel. But as it turns out, it's a heck of a lot more complicated than that. So what I'd like to do is to look at two stories, both from the Babylonian Talmud, about rabbis who traveled back and forth. Before we study these, let me warn you. These are texts about difficult questions of kashrut. Do not try to understand the technical details. If you understood the technical details, I would recommend to you a place where you could go for rabbinic ordination, because this is the kind of thing you would be examined on if you wanted to become a rabbi in Orthodox movement. Let's look at the drama of the stories instead. Consider how is it that these rabbis interact with one another, and what does it tell us about the rabbis who came from the land of Israel, traveled to Babylon, and those who came from Babylon and traveled to the land of Israel. So we'll begin with number 2. The Gemara relates that Rav Safra said to Abaye, did the master see a Torah scholar who came from the west? The west from Babylon means the land of Israel. And he said, my name is Rav Avira. He said, yeah, there was this guy, right? And there was an incident, right? So now Rav Avira is involved in this report, an incident that came before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who is the great master of the Mishnah. He's the one with whom the Mishnaic text originates. And he taught the following: a needle was found in the thickness of a reticulum. Maybe somebody knows this better than I do, but this is evidently one of the multiple stomachs of a cow. So he found a needle in the thickness of the reticulum protruding from only one side, and he deemed that animal to be treif. Okay, so not kosher because of the injury. Abaye, who's a Babylonian rabbi, right, is interested in this. So he sends a message to Rav Avira, who again is the one who's come from the land of Israel, and calls him to explain this because he knows of a contradictory teaching regarding such a case of the needle. Rav Avira refuses to come, right? As you can see in the bold is, by the way, the original text of the Talmud, and what comes in between that's not bold is it is the explanation of the translator. So Rav Avira refuses to come, so Abaye gets himself up and he goes to Rav Avira. He finds Rav Avira standing on the roof. And so Abaye says to him, let the master come down, right? Descend and come. But Rav Avira did not descend. Again, he refuses. So Abaye, and I have to emphasize here that before you came to this text, if you studied Talmud in the past, you've never heard of Rav Avira. He's an absolutely obscure figure, no reputation of any kind. Abaye, on the other hand, is one of the greatest of the Babylonian sages. His name appears in the Talmud more than almost any other teacher. So this Abaye, right, he goes up to the roof where Rav Avira is and says to him, say to me, what were the circumstances of the incident that you reported about Rabbi Yehuda Anasi and the needle in the stomach? So Rav Avira says to him, I just skipped the Aramaic Hebrew in between, says to him, I'm the director of assemblies in that study hall, and I was standing above the great rabbi, and Rav Huna of Tzitori and Rav Yosef of Midi were sitting before him, so this great array of great rabbis, and a case came before them of a needle, right, found in the thickness of the reticulum that was protruding from only one side, but not from both. And Rabbi Judah Nasi turned the reticulum over and found the drop of blood on the outside, parallel to the wound on the inside, and he deemed the animal to be treif, not kosher. And he said, if there was no wound on the outside, right, where he found the blood, then where did the drop of blood come from? There must have been a wound, even if you couldn't see the needle coming through there. So Abaye responds to this report and says to Rav Avira, you caused that man means himself, right? Because remember, he's come to travel to see Rav Avira wherever he's located himself in Babylon, and he's come up to the roof in order to see him. So you caused that man, meaning me, trouble needlessly, because this is nothing more than the teaching of the Mishnah, which states that an animal is treif if the omasim how do you pronounce that? Right, omasim, or the reticulum was perforated to the outside. End of story. Now, a lot of technicalities here, but what I'd like to concentrate on is the dynamics of the relationship. So am I being heard now? Okay.
Yeah, and maybe you can turn your camera back on.
Okay, I'm going to turn the camera back on and you'll tell me if it starts to get a little bit more difficult, but let's hope it's there. I'm going to ask for responses first and then for questions. What do you see the dynamic of this exchange to be? Again, just to describe it very, very quickly, Rav Avira has come from the land of Israel to Babylon. Right, he's got a certain report concerning an opinion of kashrut of the great Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in the land of Israel. Right, Abaye hears about this, and he says to him, well, first he calls and says, please come to me and give me details of the report. Avira refuses to come. He goes, finds him on the roof, says, come on down, let's talk about it. He refuses to come down. Abaye goes up. They quickly have an exchange, and it turns out that the rabbi who came from the land of Israel has actually reported nothing significant at all, because the case was obvious if you know the background. So first of all, responses. How would you characterize the exchange here? I don't know, anything interesting to you? Please, through the chat, if you had to interpret this relationship between the two of them meeting for the first time, what would you say about it?
Right, I'll share with you some interesting responses that are coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So one person notes that it's interesting that the Israeli rabbi is above.
Mm-hmm.
interesting that Abai seems to defer to a lesser known sage, but from Eretz Israel. So more comments to that effect, that it seems that Israel has more prestige or more authority. People are also describing the text as confrontational, that there's sort of one-upsmanship. Why does Rav Avira refuse to come down if he's the one who wanted the advice, and force Abai to go to him? The greater rabbi kowtowing to the lesser. Rav Avira seems arrogant, or has a superiority complex. A lot along those lines. So it struggles over prestige. That I would say. Yeah, I think that's where most of the responses are.
Okay, beautiful. No, that's exactly right. So, I mean, I think what you've just reported from these comments, Julia, is right on. And it's actually very, very interesting. So at first appearance, the rabbis come from the land of Israel, and he is stubborn, right? Even though he's being called upon by Abai, who is, as I say, one of the greatest Talmudic sages of all time, he refuses to respond, right? When he's called, he says, no, I'm not going to go. When he's asked to come down from the roof, he says, no, I'm not going to come down. At each occasion, it's Abai who yields. Now, I think I heard you say, as one comment, which I think was right, but ironically, that he has a superiority complex. Let me ask you a question. This goes to everybody. When somebody refuses to yield their position, to compromise their honor, is it because they've got a superiority complex? Or might that be a product of an inferiority complex? Dorothy Greenbaum, I see you on my screen, and I see you shaking your head high. Exactly, right? I mean, that, of course, is what's ironic and even funny about this. Now, we shouldn't forget that this is all told from the perspective of the Babylonians, but the Babylonians, recounting the story, see Rav Avira stubborn, refusing to yield anything of his own honor. When somebody refuses to yield their honor in the face of another scholar, is that the appropriate conduct, right, of a sage? I think it's fair to say that the answer is probably no. So now let's go back to the other part of what we saw. It's the messenger, the traveler, and this is one of those travelers who came from the land of Israel to Babylon. So one of the things the rabbis did was to make sure that the teachings of the rabbis in the land of Israel came to Babylon so that they could inform the Torah of Babylon. Avira has performed that function. He comes, but representing the land of Israel, he refuses to yield anything of his honor, even though he is engaged here with one of the greatest sages of his age, as we just said. Now let's play with that a little bit. If we were to ask a rabbi, one of the Talmudic rabbis of old, what is supposed to be the source of honor? Is it where you come from? Is it where you live? Or is it your engagement in Torah? Right? The answer will obviously be what? Right? It is Torah, right? Torah is where you make, I mean, this is not about making a name, right? Because Abai is willing actually himself to yield his honor in the face of Avira, but of course he can be confident in doing that by virtue of the fact that he is so confident in his Torah. Now, interestingly, when we get to the end of the story, this was a little bit kind of messed up in the technicalities of it, so we've got to be careful with it. But who wins this exchange? Who's right in the end? Is it Avira or is it Abai? Is this a question of being right or wrong? Maybe I could ask the question a little bit differently. Who in the end comes out unscathed, and who comes out dismissed? And what's the nature of the dismissal? I'm inviting responses, and Rabbi Endelman will share them with me.
Okay, feel free to respond in the chat to Dr. Kramer's question. Who wins? Who comes out on top?
I know I'm not sharing the text anymore, so you have to rely on your memory. Should I put it back up there?
The first people responding are saying Abaye wins.
Abaye wins. And what's the nature of his triumph?
Because he's quoting the Mishnah.
Yes, exactly right. Because he knew the answer all along, right? And Avira was simply misinterpreting the story that he reported. Once he told Abaye the story, Abaye said, "You didn't tell me something I didn't know. I already had the source for that," right? And so it's Avira who gets dismissed, and the terms of the dismissal are not as kind as they might be. In effect, what he's saying is, "You wasted my time." That's what Abaye says to Avira. But the point is that, and now let me step out of it, there is a dynamic, and the dynamic suggests something about what the Babylonian rabbis at least want to say about their relationship to the rabbi who came from the land of Israel. But what's crucial here is that the two centers of Torah see themselves as being reliant on one another. At the very least, right, what we see here is that the Babylonians feel that they do need a source in the land of Israel to bring them the teachings of the great sages of the land of Israel. In fact, there's a technical name for those messengers who traveled back and forth. Imagine this journey, and we know that these they were in effect professionals. They went back and forth all the time. They were called nachute. That's an Aramaic word. Nachat in Aramaic means to go down. So just as going to the land of Israel in Jewish parlance is to go up, to leave the land of Israel, even to go to Babylon, is to go down. So the nachute were the messengers bringing the rabbinic teachings from the land of Israel to Babylon. But the dynamic of that exchange could be complicated, as we saw right here. Okay, are there any questions about what I just said, or will we go forward? Can we go forward to the following texts?
We do have questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, just a basic question. People are wondering how long this journey would actually take.
How long would the journey actually take? I mean, of course, it always depends upon all kinds of things, but under good conditions with proper supplies and the like, it would take a couple of weeks.
Okay. All right. So actually, one of our ProSort teachers is here. Thank you, Fagit. She's asking, why does the Talmud think that this is an important story to tell? Why do you think it's here? Is it about the kashrut question, or is it about these dynamics that you're talking about?
I won't accept the dichotomy. It's about both. Of course, the kashrut question is a real question, but when you see these stories, and we're about to see another one, it's always a reasonable question. Why are they telling this as a story? So something about this recounting, we could argue, either wants to help us avoid misconstruing opinions or reported stories. It maybe wants to emphasize the correct view by putting it in the context of a story. But I think at the same time, there is a characterization here of the relationship between the communities, which is why I keep on emphasizing that this is told from the Babylonian perspective. We have no idea how Rav Avira would have spoken of this exchange with Abaye. It's not preserved.
So there are a few questions about Rav Avira, so let me put them together and you can respond how you will. So there's a question about if his name is a pun of some kind on Iver or anything else. Avera, it's more different spelling, but there's something going on there. One person is saying, well, doesn't he get credit for kind of making this trip and sort of clearly describing the details of the incident, even if he should have known? Or is there something almost, someone encapsulated the story like this. So this guy takes a really long trip to ask advice, refuses to go to where the expert is, and the answer is something he knew or should have known anyway. So I think people want to understand more how is Rabbi Vera being presented here, just even more than you've said, and sort of what are we supposed to take from that about the Eretz Israeli authorities?
Well, I mean, this is one incident involving one person, so it's hard to generalize from that, although the tone of the story may be asking us to generalize, at least in some measure. My assumption is that Avira, like the other Nahute, like the other messengers who came down from the land of Israel to Babylon, came as a reporter of rabbinic teachings from the land of Israel. And he would have filled the position that also, there's a name for this, they were professional memorizers. The rabbis did not write down their traditions. They were kept in oral form, and there were people who were reputed for their exceptional memories who would memorize the teachings and then transmit them even within the same geographical area. They would be, as it were, the living book. But in this case, you've got the living books who traveled from, in this case, the land of Israel to Babylon, in effect, bringing the Palestinian rabbinic book, the Palestinian rabbinic teaching to Babylon. In this case, he messed up. I mean, you know, at least the way the story represents itself, the greater sage by far, Abaye, is interested in knowing something about this information he's brought from the land of Israel, and Avira mishandles it, at least as the story represents it.
So we don't need to necessarily assume any kind of attitude on his part. He's playing a role. He's playing a functional role, transmitting things.
Yeah, for the present, that's absolutely right.
And any thoughts on his name, just because there's several people asking?
Yeah, I don't think so, but I would have to think about it. You know, we don't know anything about him other than the fact that he travels long distances. So, you know, Avera, let me see. I mean, it's not the same word even. You know what? It's Ayin Vav, isn't it? I don't have it in front of me. It's Ayin Vav, so it's not even the same letters. What? Yeah, it's a totally different form. I think not. I mean, I could play with it, but it strikes me that that's not the case here. Okay, so let me go on to the next text, and it will raise other issues, and they will certainly harken back to what we've got here. So let me share my screen again, and you'll tell me if I've got a problem and have to eliminate my own video when I do that, okay? Okay, you can see the text?
Yes.
Okay, and I don't care whether you see me, but it's coming through clearly?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so here we've got also a Babylonian Talmudic story, but told, as you'll see, from a different perspective. In this case, the traveling takes place in the other direction. So the Gemara tells that when Rabbi Abba went up from Babylonia to the land of Israel. So we've got travelers in both directions. Avira came from the land of Israel to Babylonia. Here you've got Abba going from Babylonia to the land of Israel. He found Rabbi Zera sitting and saying, now keep this Rabbi Zera in mind. Zera will be an important figure in the next text we'll see. He's distinctive in the accounts we have here because we know from the biographical details that are preserved in the Talmud, that he is someone who was born and grew up in Babylonia, but as an adult, actually, what we would say, he made Aliyah to the land of Israel. So here he's already in the land of Israel. Rabbi Zera was sitting and saying, Rav Huna. Okay, now he's recalling his teachers in Babylon. Okay, so Rabbi Zera in the land of Israel is recalling his teachers in Babylon and what they taught. Again, it's a Kash tradition. Rav Huna said that Rav said that a dislocated femur in a bird renders it treif, right? So dislocated femur, if you know that's what your bird looks like when you purchase it at the butcher, sorry, it's treif, you can't eat it for dinner tonight. Rabbi Abba said to him, so Rabbi Abba has also come from Babylonia by the master's life. since the day that the master came here to the land of Israel, to Eretz Israel, we had the opportunity to speak with Rav Huna, and we asked him about this matter, and he said to us, a dislocated femur in a bird is kosher. So to begin with, we've got an interesting recognition here, an interesting possibility, and that is that, first of all, and I know this myself, any of you who have ever been teachers will know this from your personal experience, you can teach one thing and your students may hear it in a different way. So it's not at all unusual for a teacher to discover that different students will report the teaching not only in different ways, but actually in contradictory ways. As you've got here, that's one possibility of what's being described here, or it may be quite simply that Rav Huna changed his mind or changed the way he was reporting Rav's position. In any case, what happens is we've been offered a correction on the earlier teaching. The earlier teaching, Rav Huna said that Rav said that this case of a dislocated femur is treif, is not kosher, whereas in the corrected version, Rav Huna, says no, actually it is kosher. So that's just the first part. It now goes on. And I also found, right, this is again, Rabbi Abba, who's come up from Babylon to the land of Israel. I also found Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, not related, sitting and inspecting birds at the convergence of sinews in the thigh. And I posed a difficulty to him, doesn't the master maintain, in accordance with the statement that Rav Huna says, that Rav says that a dislocated femur in a bird is kosher? Again, don't try to remember the details, don't worry about it. Right? Just get the sense of the dynamic here. So he's inspecting, this Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba in the thigh being the upper leg, of course. And he says, but wait a second, dislocated femur, we've learned most recently, at least, is kosher. So what are you worrying about? Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba responds and says, he said to me, I know the Mishnah, which teaches that an animal whose hind legs were severed, if they were severed from the leg joint and below, it's kosher. From the leg joint here means from what we would call the knee, the equivalent in an animal. From the leg joint and above, it's treif and unfit for consumption. And likewise, with respect to the convergence of sinews in the thigh, and Rob said about this, likewise with regard to a bird, which was the original focus here in any case, right? The story continues. Again, don't worry about the details of kashrut, just worry about the way they're relating to one another. And I said to him, if so, this statement poses a difficulty for the statement of Rav, because in the corrected version, Rav said kosher, and here they're saying, well, it may or may not be kosher, depending upon where the dislocation occurs. So Yirmiyah bar Abba is silent. I challenged him, right? This is Rabbi Abba, right? I challenged him and said to him, but perhaps there's a difference for Rav between a dislocated femur and a severed one. And he said to me, and are you interpreting Rav's halacha based upon your own reasoning? Rav said explicitly, a dislocated femur is kosher, while a severed femur is unfit, is treif. Okay, so just to get a sense of where the conclusion here is, Rav actually taught this law explicitly. Dislocation remains kosher, breaking, severed is not kosher, is treif. This is reported by Rabbi Abba, by Yirmiyah bar Abba, who has it explicitly. What I ask you to pay attention to is not the details of kosher treif, but the relationship that seems to be suggested here. So just to recall who these people are, Rabbi Abba, who came from Babylon to the land of Israel, Rabbi Zera, right, who is already relocated from Babylon to the land of Israel. So Rabbi Abba is a messenger. Rabbi Zera is someone who's actually made Aliyah. They're reporting teachings of great Babylonian rabbis in the land of Israel. Rav Huna is one of the great Babylonian rabbis. Rav is perhaps the greatest of the Babylonian teachers, and we see that their teachings regarding kashrut are being shared in the land of Israel. There's a little bit of confusion about whether what applies to animals applies to birds, about whether dislocation is the same as severing. So they go back and forth on that. In the end, the answer appears clearly going back to the opinion of Rav. So that's the way I would describe kind of the outline of the story. And I will invite you, as I did before, what does this seem to say about relationships between Babylonian and Palestinian rabbis? How are the Babylonian messengers received in Palestine? How are the opinions, the teachings of the Babylonian sages received in Palestine, the land of Israel? What would you say we learn about relationship from what we see here?
All right, so share your responses in the chat, folks. No one is yet responding to.
Really? Huh? Is that because it's less provocative?
I can't tell you.
I don't know. Well, I'm raising that publicly as a question because, yeah.
The Babylonian responses are more honored. The Babylonian scholars have the last word. Rav is superior, the Babylonian. More one-upsmanship.
Okay, good. I'm curious. I don't know if the person who said one-upsmanship, what's the one-upsmanship here? I mean, there is one-upsmanship, but what is it precisely?
The person has not added.
Oh, they're not. Okay. I think that what they're probably referring to is the fact that near the end, right, you've got an attempted interpretation. Maybe Rav is distinguishing between dislocation and severing, right? And in the end, we learn, oh no, you're relying on your own logic. As it turns out, we've got an explicit teaching to this effect. So if I'm correct in interpreting that, it is of a very particular kind, and it keeps the teaching of Rav. Good. What else? Do you have any other comments there?
One person is actually saying that he believes that Rav was originally from Eretz Israel and fuses the two traditions. I confess I do not remember that detail from.
Yes, Rav was originally from the land of Israel. Rav or Rabbi Abba, yes, came from the land of Israel, but he is universally known as, a Babylonian sage. And as I said a moment ago, one of the greatest of the Babylonian sages. That's correct, though.
What I'm getting more from the chat is people are really trying to understand the interreliance and so kind of what is the going back and forth about? I know that's the larger point of view.
Right, exactly. So
people are really trying to understand that and also trying to understand how that, which of course is a later question, but how that connects to the two Talmuds that we have today, which didn't exist as such in this time.
Perfect. Let me go in that direction. Okay, so let's deal with this at a number of layers that I might put on top of one another. On the most basic level, what we clearly see in both of these stories is, first of all, that the messengers traveled back and forth, right? We had messengers who went from the land of Israel to Babylon and others who went from Babylon to the land of Israel. Interestingly, this seems not to have been a responsibility that went in two directions. In other words, we've got evidence of messengers who took responsibility for the Palestinian tradition, transmitting it to Babylon, and that alone. They didn't bring back Babylonian traditions. And we've got others we know by name who came from Babylon to the land of Israel, but they didn't bring back Eretz Israel, land of Israel tradition. So for some reason, which is a little bit puzzling, they've got a very clear delineation. Those who were affiliated with the land of Israel and those who were affiliated with Babylon. Having said that, though, clearly one of the things we see is that each community does have some reliance on the other. Each learns from the other, although the attitudes we see in these two stories suggest that there may be a little bit of inequality, at least from the perspective of the Babylonian rabbis. So let me add the next layer. When we look not just at the simple fact of conveyance of teachings, at the fact that these communities, though distant, remained connected closely to one another, and ask what was the nature, the dynamic of their relationship, there is at least a hint in these stories that from the perspective of the Babylonian rabbis, at least, those who came from the land of Israel seemed to want to rely on the authority of the land of Israel. And the Babylonians did not respect that claim, right? There was no authority that came with being a Palestinian rabbi as such. We know from the Babylonian Talmud that the highest value is expertise in Torah, and I think that this story hints at least in a very, very suggestive way. On the other hand, in the second story that we just saw, at least as it is recalled again by the Babylonian rabbis, they believe that their teachings, that their traditions are highly respected in the land of Israel, right? If we were to ask ourselves, could you know, comparing just these two stories, could you know kashrut if you were in Babylon and didn't have the teachings of the land of Israel after the Mishnah itself? I think the answer would probably be yes. According to the second of the stories that we just saw, if we ask the same question, if you were in the land of Israel and only had the Mishnah and the teachings of the current rabbis in the land of Israel, but not the Babylonian teachings, would you be able to keep kosher in a proper way? According to the story, I think the answer is no, right? So there's an imbalance that's introduced here. And that leads me to the next part of the development that I'd like to discuss. You know, when you've got two powerful centers, say the land of Israel today, the state of Israel today, and the American Jewish community, there will be competition for power, for respect, for other things. And this was as true in that age as it is today. When I titled this, right, Traveling to Babylon for Good, I intended the pun. I intended the double entendre, and that's what I'd like to explore now. When Jews went to Babylon, was it good for them? Right? When Jews went to Babylon, did they intend after a short period to stay there? Was that their home for good, as we would say? What I'd like to suggest is that from the perspective of the Babylonian rabbis, in a kind of bold way, while they did maintain their connection, while they traveled, at least some of them, to the land of Israel, and they received the travelers who came from the land of Israel to Babylon, they considered their residence in Babylon to be for good in both senses of that term. So let me share the last piece that I've got of text, and you'll be able to see just a small part of a much longer text that spells this out, but it includes key sections of it. So let me see, I have to go like that. You can see the map. And we've got Babylonian Talmud 2 votes, 110 to 111. Let me begin just by drawing your attention to a line kind of in the middle of the English. You've got a first English paragraph, then you've got several lines in the middle, and then a brief paragraph at the end. In the middle of that, you see you've got this statement, Ulla would regularly go up to the land of Israel, but he died outside of the land. Ulla was one of these messengers. So he would travel, if you see the map at the right, just to remind ourselves of this journey, he would travel from Babylon, go up the rivers, the Euphrates, which would allow for water journey as well as land journey, then through Syria, through Phoenicia, Lebanon, from the north down into the Galilee would have been the path. So Ula went back and forth, but he finally died outside the land. We'll see why that makes a difference in a moment. But let's go back. This is part of a much longer text. We have only very small selections here. Rabbi Zerah was avoiding Rabbi Judah for the former, that is, say, Rabbi Zerah. This is the same Rabbi Zerah we saw in the second story a moment ago. Rabbi Zerah wanted to go up permanently, as it turned out, to the land of Israel, while Rabbi Judah, who was one of the great Babylonian rabbis, said, anyone who goes up from Babylonia to the land of Israel violates a positive commandment. For it is said, they shall be brought to Babylonia, and there they shall be until the day I remember them, says the Lord, quoting from Jeremiah 27. Now, remember at the beginning, we saw that text which described rabbis leaving the land of Israel, coming to the border, crying at having to leaving, turning around and saying that dwelling in the land of Israel is equivalent to all of the other commandments. Here, in effect, you've got the reversal of that. Rabbi Judah says, no, on the contrary, anyone who tries to go up from Babylon to the land of Israel violates a positive commandment. All this, while, of course, the travels between the two centers are regular. We now go on. Said Rabbi Anan, whoever is buried in the land of Israel is as though he were buried under the altar of the temple in Jerusalem. What we know about the altar is that it was the center of all atonement, of all expiation. When a sacrifice was offered on the altar, any sin that would have been committed, that had been committed, would be erased, would be cleansed, right? So to be buried in the land of Israel, it's as though you're buried under the altar, is a way of saying that this is a way that the stain of your sins during life will be eliminated. And it quotes verses to prove that. The story continues. Ulu would regularly go up to the land of Israel. He died outside the land. They came and told Rabbi Elazar, who was in the land of Israel. He said, you, Ula, should you die in an unclean field? Quoting out of context a verse from Amos, the point being that he died in the wrong place as far as Rabbi Elazar was concerned. They said to him, right, those who had witnessed Ula's bier being brought up, right, his bier is coming, right? So, he will finally, this is like those who are buried in the land of Israel to this day. But Rabbi Elazar responds and says, being gathered to the land when alive is not the same thing as being gathered into the land after death. So from the perspective of the rabbis living in the land of Israel, the compelling quality of living in the land remains powerful. And the Babylonians in their Talmud quote these teachings repeatedly. Here we've got one example. I chose it because it talks about Ula being one of these who would go back and forth between Babylon and the land of Israel. But those who live in Palestine believe that this is the Holy Land, the land of Israel, and therefore the place not only to be transported when you die, but the place to live. But the rabbis in Babylon, right, they also believe that theirs is the center of the Jewish world. They also believe that theirs is a sacred land because it is a land of Torah. And so, as you can see in the last teaching here, back to the same Rav Judah, whoever dwells in Babylonia is as though he dwelt in the land of Israel. Right? And it quotes a verse, again out of context, O Zion, escape, you who dwells with the daughter of Babylonia, which Rabbi Judah takes to be equating Zion and Babylonia. Rabbi Judah was a very, very powerful advocate for the center in Babylon. If you will allow me the translation, and then I want to open up for questions and discussion of this, because I think there's a lot to discuss here. Travel was common. These centers were closely connected, but they also competed with one another. Each recognized the power of the other, but asserted its own power at the same time. The center in the land of Israel insisted that this was the promised land, the Holy Land. And even if one makes it after death, right, for atonement to occur, that's not nearly good enough. This is the place where a Jew should live. But at the same time, you've got people like Rabbi Judah in Babylon itself who know that this is a community that has been there for centuries, from the time of the Babylonian exile, nearly 600 BCE. We're talking about 900 years later, 800 to 900 years later, when Rabbi Judah is offering this teaching. You've still got a Jewish community in Babylon. It has flourished, it has become strong, and it is a place where Jews go. It is a place to visit because it is one of the great Jewish centers, even from the land of Israel. Right? It's a place to come visit. You've got two centers of the Jewish world, Babylon and the land of Israel. Each asserts its power, its place in the ascendancy of the world that Jews know. And it's worth that competition. It's not a bad competition. And one of the ways the competition is lived out is through these travelers who go back and forth. If there's a center there, it's worth going to see. It doesn't mean that you give up your insistence that where you find home, that home is for good. At the same time, we also struggle to maintain a relationship, and they did that at length and powerfully. It's something I think that offers a model for us, because we live in a world where we've got two great centers of Jewish life, right? Two truly great centers of Jewish life. And it's important for us to travel back and forth, for us to maintain our connections. But none of that means that we give up on our insistence that where we live is for good, where we live is powerful. It is a powerful Jewish center. There's a lot more that can be said here, Julia, but why don't we just open it up and see what people have to say?
Great. All right, so maybe before some of the bigger questions, a number of people did ask if we were reading stories from the Palestinian Talmud, the Yerushalmi, would we be seeing a different attitude than what we see in Babylonian Talmud stories?
You know, what's interesting is that there are very few of these stories in the Palestinian Talmud. It's not that they don't exist, and the short answer is wherever, listen, stories are always told from the perspective of the person telling the story. That's just a rule. It has some rare exceptions, but if you had a, formulate a rule that has very, very few exceptions, this would be one of them. People tell stories in order to serve their own interests. And so we see that here in the case of the Babylonian Talmud. That doesn't disturb me, by the way. I mean, because what interests me is that the Babylonians, even in the face of the Palestinian center, are willing to express, to assert themselves in this way. Of course, the rabbis in the land of Israel do. And whether we don't have these exact stories in their equivalent Palestinian versions, we've got other stories in Palestinian versions. And of course, they will speak about the ascendancy of the land of Israel.
Okay, and one more contextual question. A few people asked why, you mentioned that they didn't write things down, they brought traditions orally. So people were wondering about that.
You mean like, why did they do that?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. It's a great question that has an easy answer and then a more complicated answer. The easy answer is because, for those of you who know this distinction, Judaism has had, at least since the rabbinic period, what it terms, terminologically speaking, two Torahs, a written Torah and an oral Torah. And the written Torah is, of course, scripture as we know it, and oral Torah is rabbinic teachings. We do have evidence that the rabbis kept written notes but they were not the official version of everything. So this is the more interesting and more complicated version of it. Judaism is one tradition, and there were many such traditions, that in the pre-printing world, or in the pre-literary world, another way to say it, the official version of teachings was preserved orally. It was a traditional statement. It was a claim that you needed to be the disciple of a teacher who would admit you into their disciple, to be a disciple, who would then repeat to you their teachings, and they would test you on their teachings to see if you've gotten it correct. And then you would go at it, you would repeat those teachings elsewhere. There were written versions of these texts, but the written versions were never the official versions. The oral version was the version that mattered. Oral traditions of this sort are common. I mean, certain parts of Islamic tradition have the same distinction between the Quran as a written text and other parts of an oral tradition, and you could enumerate many other examples.
And there's a view that it's forbidden to write down the oral tradition.
Yeah, there is, but that's wrong. I mean, that which is why I didn't give it. Yes, I mean, you do find there's a teaching in the Talmud itself that says that you're forbidden to write down the oral Torah. But the very same text that offers us that prohibition gives us examples of rabbis writing down oral Torah. So if in one breath you're going to say you're forbidden to write oral Torah, and then you're going to tell us about great rabbis who write down oral Torah, I don't take the prohibition all that seriously.
Right. So it's more that actually the oral preservation and delivery is part of it's part of what lends authority, right? It's
Exactly.
part of why we so-and-so said in the name of so-and-so, right? It's all about, excuse me, the authority of the transmitted tradition.
That's right. Exactly right. Yes. And if you think about it, it's very important because, books can merely reside on shelves, right? If you call people to, stand up and to memorize these things and then to serve as the manner of conveyance to the next generation, right? It's a living witness to another living witness. That's part of what is enacted here. Each generation of those who memorize parts of the tradition becomes a living witness to that tradition.
Great. Okay, so there are a number of questions about the Babylonian and about the two Talmudim, and I guess I'll focus on this one. How and why did they develop separately? Like, was there ever an idea of, we should have one Talmud?
Can you hear me now, Julia?
Your video is frozen, but I can hear you.
I just stopped my video because I got that same. So let me just stay oral right now. Okay.
Okay, great. So the question is about the two Talmudim. Why do we have two? Why did it develop that way? Are they equally authoritative? Was there ever an idea we should have one Talmud and all the traditions should go in it together? And of course, each Talmud has teachings from both places. So what is having these two versions? How are we supposed to understand that? And what are we supposed to learn from that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. First of all, just a fact of the history of what I've been describing, which we don't know how to explain. The Babylonian Talmud was completed. Editing is not the right word for its completion. Later than the Palestinian Talmud. It includes more Palestinian teachings than the Palestinian Talmud includes Babylonian teachings. For some reason, the traveling that I just described between the two centers, we have to assume that travel continued forever, but for some reason, in the mid-4th century, the messengers stopped, right? In other words, when you look at the Babylonian Talmud, we don't have any teachings from Palestinian teachers after the mid-4th century. And the same thing is true in the other direction. And we don't know why. For some reason, either the connection was broken or they ceased to rely on one another. So, this world of exchange was 3rd century and first half of 4th century. Now, with respect to the two Talmuds are radically different documents. You could study one and barely recognize the other. There are a number of reasons why the Babylonian Talmud became the authoritative Talmud, why it was the Talmud that won in the end. Part of that is because the center of the world moved to Babylon when during the Muslim conquest. Baghdad, which was Babylon. We're talking about literally down the street at that point where the rivers come closest to one another. That's where Baghdad is located, as well as the ancient city of Babylon. This was the center of the world. It was a vast empire, and the Babylonian rabbinic academies were there in Baghdad when Baghdad controlled the known world. And so the Talmud of those academies became the Talmud. There are those who would argue, and I would include myself here, that the Babylonian Talmud is actually a more finely written document, that it's superior in a number of ways. And as I said, it is unambiguously very different than the Palestinian Talmud. In terms of the history of the two documents, the Babylonian sages dismissed the Palestinian Talmud, saying that it was inferior. They said it explicitly. And interestingly, as far as halakha is concerned, the only place where the Palestinian Talmud is relevant is in laws of agriculture. And that's because the Babylonian Talmud does not have tractates on laws of agriculture that pertain only in the land of Israel. So for modern observant Jews who once again have fields and produce in the land of Israel, the Palestinian Talmud offers a source for some of the laws. Otherwise, the Palestinian Talmud has very little to say for the observant Jew.
Thank you. All right, so one person who, the way I'm reading her question is that she lives neither in Israel nor in New York, is kind of observing that there's a way of talking about things as if they're just two places that matter and everyone else is sort of ancillary or just like really not even worth talking about. And it's almost like there's the same thing going on here. So I'm kind of putting that together with some other questions about, was anyone outside of these two places considered authoritative? Were there meaningful in size Jewish communities elsewhere that had their own authorities, or were they all sending them their questions here? That's the question, sort of the places other than these two centers.
Okay, so great question, whoever asked that one. There is no doubt that there is a Jewish chauvinism expressed both in the land of Israel today and in the greater New York area today. So, those of us who identify with those communities should take the message that we have to be careful with the way we express ourselves. Having said that, of course, then and now, there were Jews in many, many other places, right? The ancient world, we know where there are Jews today, although, of course, Jewish communities outside of the land of Israel and a few other centers, New York, Los Angeles, London, and so forth, are much, much smaller. We all know that. In the ancient world, there were many Jewish communities scattered throughout Asia Minor, some further east, Egypt, further west along the Mediterranean. The Jewish diaspora had already spread far and wide. There were Jews in Rome during the period that we've been discussing. Some of you have probably visited the Jewish catacombs outside of Rome, which are really a treat to visit and show the influence both of local Roman custom, but also some connection to what was going on in the land of Israel. Having said all of that, for the period we are discussing, right, we know little about authority outside of the rabbis and the political structure in Babylon and the land of Israel. So the rabbis There may have been rabbis elsewhere. We never hear of them except on travels of rabbis here and there. But the rabbis were confined to the land of Israel and Babylonia. There was a patriarch at the head of the Jewish community in the land of Israel and an exilarch at the head of the Jewish community in Babylon. So whether we're talking about rabbinic authority or political ethnic authority, the only two places in the ancient world where we know of notable Jewish authority were the land of Israel and Babylon. We have to assume, though, that of course there were local authorities. They just weren't significant enough to have registered outside of their own communities, is the way I would put it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question about if the route between these two centers, like were there sort of significant places along the way that developed as a result of this exchange, or sort of interim academies? Is there anything happening geographically in between these two places that would be interesting for us in this context?
Okay, what a great question. I'm going to turn my video back on. So Julia, tell me if it freezes again. So maybe people will be able to see me. It's an absolutely fantastic question. We know that there were Jewish communities in between. And it is fair to assume that rabbis and others who traveled back and forth found their place, night after night with these communities. One of the interesting things when we examine the structures of Jewish communities during this period is that the synagogue, we assume that a synagogue is a place of prayer. The evidence for synagogues, both in the land of Israel and outside, at least in the second and even into the 3rd century, is that even when they became places of prayer, that was not their original function. As the name synagogue suggests, right, it's the equivalent of the Hebrew Beit Knesset, which I think is best translated as community house. That is what a synagogue was. A synagogue was a community house. It was a place where the Jewish community got together for a variety of reasons. And we know that synagogues also functioned as way stations. Right. So there were, of course, inns where people stayed as they were traveling in between. And the route between Babylon and Palestine along the coasts going south to Egypt was a very, very popular trade route. Jews were far from the only ones who were traveling that route. And so you could find an inn and get a beer at many, many places along the route. But we also know that Jewish communities in their community houses welcomed Jews from elsewhere, provided them with meals, provided them with a place to stay. And it's fair to say that the rabbis would have taken advantage of this. During this period, there were not yet academies elsewhere, right? If there were academies at all, I might say. It seems that the rabbinic estate during this period was mostly centered it was created in disciple circles. You would have a rabbinic master, right, a well-known rabbi who would gather disciples around him. There was no formal academy at which they were located. It may have been at his own home, in fact, or somewhere else in the nearby community. And since there were no rabbis who made permanent homes along the trade route, there also were no rabbinic centers along the route. It was in Babylon and in the land of Israel.
And we don't have evidence of those communities sending questions to either of these centers as we do in the medieval period.
No, not yet. You're quite right. I mean, Babylon and the fact that the rabbis in the academies, formal academies, beginning in the Abbasid period in the 8th century, mid-700s, those academies were recognized internationally, and as you say, they received questions from all over the Jewish diaspora. But no, such a mechanism had not yet developed during this period.
Some people are asking about the different Babylonian academies, which requires some prior knowledge, but is were there similar kinds of tensions? I don't even actually confess, I don't know how far apart these places even were. It's hard for me to tell that from the stories, but were there any kind of similar dynamics among the Babylonian academies? Is there anything comparable to Bavel versus Eretz Yisrael, or is it really clearly like it's a different thing, the relationship between the land of Israel and Babylonia?
I don't think we have enough evidence or convincing evidence to suggest that the academies competed with one another during this period. Again, possibly for the simple reason that there were no academies as such. There was a rabbinic center in Pumbedita, there was a rabbinic center in Sura, and so forth. That means that there were rabbinic masters who taught in those places, but not formal academies. And we have many, many stories of rabbis being jealous of one another, of competing with one another. This, after all, is what people do, and scholars are not exempt from that kind of competition. What's interesting is if you ask about the later period, when Baghdad became the center after the Muslim conquest and the yeshivas resettled in Baghdad, so the yeshiva of Pumbedita, the yeshiva of Sura, they claimed this tradition going back. I'm not an expert in this in the same way as I am in the Talmudic here, but I also can't recall any discussion of the kind of competition that I think we see here clearly between Babylon and the land of Israel. But I think it's because, listen, I mean, you can't talk about Jewish life in the world. You can't talk about Jewish diaspora without considering, and how does the land of Israel fit into all of this? Is that a place we are meant to go today? Is that a place we will go only in the future? What does it mean to, I mean, just to put this before everybody, I imagine many, perhaps most of the people who are, with us today have gone as tourists to the land of Israel. What does it mean for a Jew to go as a tourist to the land of Israel? Right? You travel there, you look at a few sites, and you go home? Really? Is a Jew allowed to do that? Right? Now, I have to say that Maimonides said a Jew is not allowed to do that, even though Maimonides went to the land of Israel and then left. He actually transgressed his own law in order to do that. That is one of the great ironies of the great sage we call Maimonides. But the Babylonians, who had great self-confidence, and really did believe that they were in Babylon for good, they couldn't ignore the land of Israel, and maybe that's some of the competitive spirit we hear behind the ways they tell these stories. To be fair though, right, the sages in the land of Israel had the land of Israel. The sages in Babylon had Torah. And even the rabbinic teachers in the land of Israel during this period admit that the greatest sages on earth were located not in the land of Israel, but in Babylon. They do not hesitate to admit that.
Okay, so last question in 60 seconds. You started to go in this direction, but the question is really about today. All these dynamics that we have hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there's the mutual respect, there's wanting to include the teachings of the other in one's own kind of codified tradition. There's also condescension and a sense of superiority and who's really the center. Any words on on what we can learn from this in terms of the dynamics that we're dealing with today?
Well, I hope that's what I conveyed before, but I'll restate it now. I think it's great for the Jewish communities in the United States and the land of Israel and elsewhere, right? But these are unambiguously the two great centers, the land of Israel and the United States. I think it's great that we are open to one another, that we learn from one another, and so forth. I personally think that it's a serious mistake to imagine that they are the center and we are the periphery. I support a model which sees multiple centers. I don't think that is a contradiction in terms or even in geometry. And so I'll leave it with that.
Great. And you have you have the whole Talmudic corpus backing you up on that arrangement being a one that works. All right, so I wanted to, of course, thank you for teaching today, and this is such a wonderful way to tie up this series about wanderings. You know, the idea of our rootedness in multiple places, and how that's okay, and sort of what that means for us and how it plays out in our lives, both then and now. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us. I also, in addition to, again, thanking our sponsors for today, the Bismans and the Bergens, so many people, many of you made donations to support our community learning programs throughout this series, and we're tremendously grateful, and that really has made this series possible, and subsequent series. So thank you for learning with us. Thank you for supporting us. We hope very much to continue learning with you in the fall, whether you are in New York or Israel or any other holy city around the world. In the meantime, I wish you a Shana Tova, and thank you again to Professor Kraemer for teaching us today. Take care, everyone.
Shana Tova to everybody.